Am I correct in understanding that God's covenant with Abraham is now the second covenant in the Old Testament? What exactly is meant by the concept of covenant?
Joshua, you're exactly correct. This is the second covenant, if we remain with those exact words, that God is making with people in the Bible. The first one he makes with Noah in Genesis chapter 9, in which he promises that there will be seed time and harvest and winter and summer, but God will never ever again destroy the earth through the means of the flood. And he made a visible sign of that covenant promise in terms of a rainbow. I simply want to accent that point now because later on in our discussion through the Old Testament, I want to help you understand that when God makes promises, he connects those promises with physical, tangible elements in creation. And he does that obviously with a rainbow, and he'll do this with Avram in chapter 15 by means of splitting open animals. But for now, let's answer the second part of your question. What exactly is meant by the concept of covenant? In the Hebrew, the idea literally is to cut a covenant. That's very important because every English translation translates cut with make. And by making that translation from cut to make, we end up not quite understanding what it means to make or cut a covenant. So using the literal Hebraic sense of cutting a covenant, karath barith in Hebrew, the idea is exactly this. Before I would make a promise with you, I would go out and I would find a certain number of animals, and I would kill them, and I would slice them in two. And then as I make my word known to you, my promise revealed to you, I would walk through these slit animals with one half of the animal on one side and one half in the other, and I go right in between. And as I do this, I'm indicating to you, who I am actually promising something to, that if I go against my word, may I be cut in two just like these dead animals. Now, where do we find what the foundation of this idea of cutting a covenant is all about? It actually happens for us, as we look at the slide, through Hittite treaty forms. Perhaps I say Hittite and you say Uriah, and you'd be right. Uriah would be the most famous Hittite in the Bible, who was the husband of Bathsheba, whom David took to be his wife. But long before Uriah the Hittite came along, there would be a nation of Hittites. Now there's Hittites and Amalekites and Moabites and Jebusites and Phlebites and Budlites and Millerites. So there's all these ites in the Bible. And we have to kind of keep them straight. And just so we have it for the record, there are not actually Phlebites, Millerites, or Budlites. But there are Hittites, and these Hittites tell us how they cut covenants. And so you can see on your slide that the Hittites had two kind of covenant treaties. One we would call parity, which would be between equals. We're not too concerned about that in the Bible because no one is equal to God. But the second Hittite treaty is very much our concern. It's between a suzerain and a vassal. And in this case, Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, he is the suzerain, and Israel, or David, or Abraham, or anyone else, would be the vassal. So in this case, what is happening throughout the Bible is God is cutting covenants with people. in a suzerain-vassal relationship, much like the Hittite political treaties would cut covenants. And whenever we have this idea of cutting a covenant, there's always the shedding of blood and there's always death. I want us now to again have a typological moment to understand that whenever God is making a covenant in the Old Testament, this idea of death and blood is certainly right at the forefront. And typologically, we see this happening at Calvary through the slain lamb. As Jesus offers the new covenant in the upper room on Maundy, Thursday, it's all pointing to this covenant he is about to cut on the following day. And there would be the death of the Son of God and the shedding of his blood. And in that final act of covenant making, God's promises are sure and certain. We'll go on as we continue this fascinating idea of cutting covenants and how it's going to show itself not only in the upper room and on Calvary, but throughout the Old Testament. In being so consumed with Hittite treaties and cutting covenants, I believe I failed to summarize for you what exactly was going on when God cut a covenant with Avram. We already noticed that sevenfold promise, but God would seal his word with a visible sign, something we have already discussed with Noah and the rainbow. And in sealing his promise, that sevenfold promise in Genesis 12, 2 and 3, God called Avram to cut animals in half in chapter 15. And as you can see on the slide, God came through all of those animals by means of a boiling pot and a lit torch. Through those physical means, God was indicating to Avram that he can be counted on when he makes his promises. What is so remarkable is that God goes through the cut, slain, bloodied animals, but Avram does not. In most Hittite treaties, whether it's a parity treaty or a suzerainty vassal treaty, the idea is that both parties of the covenant and agreement walk through the dead animals to indicate that if one of them goes against their word, they deserve death. But in this case, it's so different. Look at your slide. Avram has his arms and his hands placed on his side. That golden figure there. What we're going to see throughout these overheads is when people have arms raised, they're responding in faith and praise to God. But when they have their hands on their hips, like we have Avram here in this slide, they're not responding at all. Well, what in the world is Avram doing in Genesis 15 when God is doing what he is doing in terms of going through the slain animals, and Avram isn't? Guess what he's doing? He's sleeping. He's sleeping. He's in a deep sleep, the scripture says. The same kind of deep sleep Adam was in when God caused him to fall into this deep doze and take out a rib. It's the same kind of deep sleep that Jonah is in chapter 1 when he's not concerned about the storm. This is a very rare Hebrew word used for a deep sleep, totally out of it. Well, what does that mean? It means that this covenant is not based upon Avram at all. It's based solely upon God. Only God goes through the slain animals, not Avram, to confirm this threefold promise that we can take from the sevenfold structure of Genesis 12, 2 and 3. And there you see it on your slide. God is going to give Avram land and offspring. He'll be a blessing to the nations. But all of this, as we said earlier, is now going to ride on God's agenda and according to His plan and His promises, and really have no basis on us and what we do. In fact, this is a sure and certain guarantee. This is a pivotal promise God makes, and it's echoed again in Genesis 17, verse 6, where God tells now Abraham, his name has finally been changed, that I am making with you and your offspring an everlasting covenant. We can count on this covenant that is cut in chapter 15 forever. We are going to see when Israel is in desperate straits, when they don't have a snowball's chance in hell, what do they appeal to? They appeal to this covenant God cut with Abraham. Abraham, he's a recipient of God's grace. What's he doing? Sleeping. It all depends on God, not on us. That's what this covenant with Avram means in Genesis 15. And Joshua, thank you for letting me reboot the question and make sure we get this fundamental idea down as we progress through this journey of the Old Testament.